We found a statue of a woman down by the river. By Madoto-78. When I was 13 years old, my cousin and I found a golden statue by the river. We spent most afternoons down there. Eloise, or Lou as everyone called her, would be skipping rocks or hanging upside down from the branches, while I looked at fish and bugs and leaves under my magnifying glass, referring to my books and writing down notes. I was picking some nice flowers to take home to my dad when I looked over and saw a spark of gold sticking out of the mud. I called Lou over. It was half buried in the mud of the riverbank, and Lou used her water gun to squirt the dirt away so we could see it better. It was a life-sized woman with a rose-covered veil over her face, so only her mouth showed. Her head was downturned and cocked to the side, and her arms were down by her sides, the palms up. It kind of looked like she was shrugging. Lou squirted the base with water so the carved engraving showed. "Oh, it's in a different language," I said with disappointment. "Or hieroglyphics. I should bring my book on Egypt over." At that age, I was deeply in my mythology phase. Lou sent me a funny look. "What are you talking about, Frankie?" she said, and I blinked. The carvings that had been just symbols before were suddenly readable English. "Hold my hands and make a wish," it read, and a loopy signature that said, "Rose Gold." "Maybe it fell off of a circus train or something," said Eloise. "You know, one of those creepy fortune-telling thingamajigs you see at carnivals." I watched as she got out her phone from her backpack to take a photo. The logical part of me said the words changing had just been my mind playing tricks on me. The animal part of me was completely unnerved. I should run from this thing as fast as I could. "Gonna make a wish?" asked Lou with a grin. I flinched as she walked towards the statue and took one of its hands. "Jesus, don't touch it," I said at once. My heart felt like a swollen lump and a fresh cold sweat had broken on my forehead. "Oh my God, are you afraid of it?" Lou jeered. What should I wish for? Well, it is Valentine's Day soon. Maybe I should wish for your dad to find a special someone to have a special time with? Classy, I replied with a glare. My dad was a touchy subject. I lived with my auntie Andy, my dad Sky, and Lou, except for every second weekend when she visited her dad. Lou's dad, Uncle Leith, used to have split custody, but he was a bit of a wreck, so now Lou lived with us basically permanently. Lou looked like a girly girl with her long blonde hair and rainbow dresses, but she was the complete opposite. More gross and wild than any boy in our class. I looked like a nerd with my big glasses and black plaits, and was exactly how I looked. At the top of my class in everything but PE. My dad, Sky, had an intellectual disability, and as soon as I found that out, I went into research mode. I learned that it meant he had an IQ under 70, that intellectual disabilities are either mild, moderate, severe, or profound. Dad's intellectual disability was mild. He could look after himself and didn't need a carer, but he had trouble understanding a lot of things. Auntie Andy and Uncle Leith had written a book that made enough money for them both to comfortably live off. My dad made a whole lot of teas, fragrances, soaps, and bath bombs that he sent off to fancy shops that overpriced them. My mother was a mystery. Apparently, my dad had just arrived home with me one day. Lou questioned why we were all so certain I even was my dad's daughter. He could have just kidnapped me. She said it in a half-joking way, but it was odd that all the grown-ups just accepted I was his daughter. I didn't even look like him much, except for our dark hair. "Come on, make a wish, Lou said. "You chicken shit. Come on. What's the harm? It's just a dumb statue." "Monkey's paw," I muttered, and Lou frowned. We were the same age, but she hadn't read as much as I had. "What?" she said, and I shrugged. "Monkey's paw, you know, careful what you wish for, it'll go wrong," I said, like in the Treehouse of Horror episode. Understanding crossed Lou's face. "How can meeting a special person to have a special time with go wrong?" she said, "unless it means having a special time with the Grim Reaper." I imagined going back home to Auntie Andy, crying, and Dad dead on the ground. "I don't know what happened," she'd sob. "He just dropped dead out of nowhere." I felt a flutter of panic in my throat. Lou glanced at me guiltily. "Look, it's not even real," said Lou. "It's grotty and cheap looking. It's just a bloody fortune-telling thing someone chucked out." I remembered the symbols changing with the blink of an eye to English. Had it just been my imagination? A dull clunk broke me from my thoughts. Lou had given the statue a mighty kick. "Dumb piece of crap," she said. "Come on, Frankie, let's just go home. I'm starving anyway." With that, she walked off with her water gun over her shoulder to the forest path that would take us back home. I lingered, staring down at the statue. It was a creepy thing to find out here in the forest, that's for certain. I didn't like being alone with it. I don't know how to explain the feeling. It just had a strange vibe about it, like thinking you'd seen a dark figure move out of the corner of your eye, but then looking to see it was just a coat rack. Not dangerous, just uneasy. Before I knew what I was doing, I was reaching over to take its hand. It was cold, slightly damp with river water and mud. I looked over my shoulder to make sure Lou was gone. Just a stupid statue. Like throwing a coin in a wishing well, just a dumb bit of fun. Might as well make the wish I'd been doing since I was 5 whenever I blew out my birthday candles. I whispered. I wish I knew about my mother. Nothing happened, of course. The statue just glinted in the morning sun. I wiped my hand off on my clothes and wandered off after Lou. At the end of the forest trail, we ducked under the bar that separated the trail from our dead-end street. Lou and I always got up earlier than everyone else to go explore the river. My Auntie Andy had no idea why we got up at dawn nearly every day. "River's not going anywhere, is it?" she'd say. Lou and I always found the walking path got too crowded during the day, other kids swinging off the branch into the river and drenching my book while I was trying to look up different types of mosses. It was better first thing in the morning. There were still a couple of joggers about, but they were quiet, so we didn't mind them. Also, getting up early meant I got to meet the postie every morning. He was scary looking but cool, tall and muscular with straggly gray hair that hung from the helmet over his face. He delivered my monthly science magazines, and sometimes we'd have a chat about it before he got back on his motorbike. As Lou and I trundled over the front gate, the postie pulled over on his bike. He passed me the morning mail, glancing at my muddy hand. "Digging for worms, were ya?" he asked, and I snorted. "That's what 5-year-olds do," I said. "I'm trying to find some freshwater mollusks from my latest magazine." "I thought you were looking for moss," he said. "No, that was last month. This month is mollusks," I said. "Not bad to eat some of them," he said. "Maybe not the ones you find down the river, though." "Of course not," I said, as he got on his bike and drove off with a wave. I went through the front door that Lou had left open. My dad was curled up in the armchair with his latest knitting project in his lap. He often fell asleep there at night and forgot to go to bed. My dad had shaggy brown hair and big brown eyes, and often a pensive expression on his face like he was off in his own world. Auntie Andy was sitting at the table with a coffee, looking exhausted. My aunt was blonde and blue-eyed like Lou. Her upper teeth stuck out and her eyes went in different directions. Auntie Andy did odd jobs around the neighborhood like putting up fences and mowing lawns. The book money meant she didn't need to work, but she still did so she wouldn't die of boredom, as she once told me. It was better than Uncle Leith, who just smoked weed all day and played his guitar on the porch until his neighbors complained. "Hello," she said with a yawn as I put the mail on the table in front of her. "Get some nice flowers for Dad?" "Yeah," I said as I put the bag at the foot of Dad's armchair. "Just some daisies and bottle brushes." "Nice," said Auntie Andy. Over at the pantry, Lou was climbing the shelves and grabbing as much food as she could get her hands on. "Bloody Nora!" Auntie Andy snapped at her, and Lou looked around, mouth stuffed full of pretzels. "Get down from there acting like you've never been fed." Lou shrugged, grabbing the peanut butter and jumping down. The thump of her shoes woke up my dad. "Morning," Auntie Andy said to him. "You need to stop sleeping in the armchair. It'll screw up your back." "Sorry," said Dad, sleepily rubbing his eyes. He looked at the bag of flowers on the floor and smiled, bending down to go through it. "Thank you," he said to me. "Want to see what we found in the river?" Lou said to her mother with her mouth full of food. Auntie Andy just shrugged as Lou felt around for her phone. "Come on, Uncle Sky. Do you want to see it?" Lou said, getting out her phone. My dad limped over to her curiously. He'd had a bad leg my whole life. Lou tapped for a few seconds and then showed them the photo. I jumped at the loud crashing sound. Auntie Andy had dropped her cup. Hot coffee splashed everywhere. Lou stared at her mother in shock. Auntie Andy's face had fallen into an expression of pure horror. Lou and I stared with fright as my dad wrapped his arms around himself. His breathing was getting harsh and short. I thought he was going to hyperventilate. Auntie Andy stood up, put her arm around him, and herded him from the room. Lou and I were left alone in the kitchen. We stared at each other. "What the hell?" said Lou. About an hour after my dad's and aunt's freak out over the photo, Uncle Leith came over and took Lou and me to get takeaway. Dad had locked himself in his room and I could hear his harsh, scared breathing behind the door. I'd eavesdropped on Auntie Andy on the phone. "I'm trying not to have a meltdown, Leith," she had said. "Please, can you come over and take the girls out for a bit? I need to calm down, and then I need to calm Sky down, and then I need to work out what the hell's going on. I don't want the girls to see me like this." Growing up, I always looked down my nose at Uncle Leith. There was this helplessness about him. Unlike Auntie Andy and my dad, Uncle Leith didn't work, just lived off the money from the book. His hair was messy. He didn't shave. He smelled of cigarette smoke, booze, and weed, and he just looked grubby and unwashed. There was always this dazed look in his eyes, like he was in a perpetual state of shock. In hindsight, I think I judged him too hard. He picked us up in his lemon of a car, and we drove in silence to get burgers and chips. "You want to go play in the playground?" he murmured. He was worse than usual, his eyes completely glazed over and boggling, mouth hanging half open, moving like he was in slow motion. "We're a bit old for it now," I said. Uncle Leith just nodded, picking at his food. "What's wrong with Mum and Uncle Sky?" asked Lou in a tiny voice. Lou was always quiet with her dad, barely saying a word compared to her usual chatterbox self. I think she was a bit embarrassed and didn't know how to react to him. It's too hard to explain," said Uncle Leith. Then he reached into the glove box and passed us both a book each. I recognized it as the one he'd written with Auntie Andy. I was an avid reader, but I'd never been interested in my family's book. I'd never read a memoir before, more interested in fiction and science. It was a very slim little paperback, and the title read, "The Great Scam Pan." On the front was a picture I recognized from Greek mythology of the god Pan, with the upper half of a man and the lower half of a goat. On the back I saw a black and white photo of Auntie Andy and Uncle Leith looking very young and very serious. "Just read it and you'll get it," said Uncle Leith. He drove us back home and let us out. Lou and I walked nervously inside the house. Auntie Andy looked up from the couch with a beer can in her hand. Dad was curled up on his armchair, sucking on his knuckles. "Sorry for scaring you girls," she said. "Did Uncle Leith explain?" I just showed the book to her. She nodded. "It's better said in there," she said. "We did have editors making it sound good and all that." She finished off the beer, crushing the can in her hand. Lou and I went to our bedrooms. I opened the book up. In the back was a few photos. Some were from the newspapers and showed Andy, Leith, and Sky looking very young and frightened, huddled up together. The headlines said stuff like, "Survivors of Secret Cults," and "Terrorized Children Speak Out." The next photo was of the golden statue we'd found in the river, standing in the middle of a clean, white, sterile-looking laboratory, with a few people gathered around her with notepads and mysterious machinery. One of the photos was of Auntie Andy in a hospital bed with Uncle Leith awkwardly carrying a newborn Lou like she was a sack of flour. The last photo was of my dad, on the porch seat out back. Sticking out the top of his jumper was a little dark-haired toddler. He was reading me a book. I remember as a kid constantly being carried around my dad in his coat or jumper. He was always reluctant to put me down. My first memory was being somewhere warm and cozy, looking up to see big, dark brown eyes peering down at me. It felt strange to see the memory in photo form. I don't remember Dad reading me the book. but I do remember feeling safe and comfortable. I opened up the book and began to read. While Leith, formerly known as just Leaf, and I were writing this book, my father Liam Arcadia, formerly Liam Paulson, was found not guilty of ritualistic murder. Everyone else in his little cult went on the stand to defend him, and it was the word of a bunch of kids versus dozens of adults. According to them, all we young people just committed mass suicide for no reason. I must admit, a lot of our story sounds batshit insane. Yet the authorities actually had Rose Gold in their possession for a long time before she went missing, so she's not a lie. I'm going to skip a lot of the minor details of my early life. I know everyone just wants to know how it all went down, how the secret cult fell apart, the sequence of events that led to us escaping it all. My father Liam founded the community in the late 60s. It's a common story. A lot of cults start this way. He ran a spiritual class, then the power got to his head, and he ran off with a dozen members to hide out in the forest away from society. The community was pretty much just Liam taking bits from pagan religions and the free love movement and warping them to his liking. We worshipped Pan, focusing on the fact he was the god of the wild and music and was linked with sex and fertility. A life of emulating Pan was pretty enticing, and Liam gathered up a huge group of people wanting to dance, drink, and screw all night and day. A lot of pagans honor a mother and father goddess and god. It can really be whoever you like, whoever you feel an affinity to. It can be from Celtic, Greek, Norse, Egyptian, or any other mythology that speaks to you. To worship your god or goddess of choice, you prayed and gave offerings to them. The horror films tell you all pagans want to sacrifice people as offerings to their hell god. In reality, most offerings are just nice wine, flowers, pretty trinkets, artwork, or anything you'd think the god or goddess would enjoy. On the surface, our secret community looked like a hell of a lot of fun. Worshipping Pan meant it was just non-stop party. What a great way to live, right? You didn't have to dig very deep to discover we were actually a mess. We were the first generation to have been born and raised in the community. Older siblings had been brought along by their parents, who were the first members. Among the little kids and teenagers, it was honestly hard to keep up with who belonged to what father. There was so much sex, our mothers just had no idea. You see Liam's badly thought out utopia quickly falling apart? We had been raised to believe getting crushes was a taboo, because people our own age might be a sibling. Us girls shouldn't get a crush on an older man because he might be our dad. There was always a secret fear of accidental incest about the community. We would never have lasted very long, because we would have absolutely ended up interbreeding and then dying off from it. My mother had my brother, Sky, with a different father. The adults gossiped about how Liam had started getting problems performing as he got older, which meant we didn't have any other siblings. Sky being slow and me being ugly, it was called incredibly ironic that we were the only safe bets among the teenagers. The whole community, although it preached free love, was whiter than snow. I only met people who weren't white after I left. We still found a way to discriminate on appearance, though. See, Liam was blonde, so all the blondes in the community felt superior to the brunettes. I know, we didn't even have redheads. The girls tended to buy into the whole blonde versus brunette rubbish more than the boys. Not saying the boys didn't bully each other, but it just wasn't over hair color. They were more likely to pick on Sky because he was a bit slow, or make fun of me for being ugly and worm-ridden. Being an isolated community, we tried to avoid doctors as much as possible. I'd suffered from worms all through my childhood, and because it had gone untreated for so long, I was pretty malnourished as a result. Now I'm blonde, but I'd had the worms and also had an overbite, and was wall-eyed, so I was still an outcast. Juniper, or Jupiter, as she was called growing up, was the biggest outcast out of us, as she was overweight and brunette. The three other brunettes, Wren, or Gwen, as she secretly called herself, Fern and Hazel, had made a little group and looked down on the rest of us. I'd rather be with them, but even though I was an outcast, I was still blonde and an enemy in their eyes. So our father god was Pan, and our mother goddess was Rose Gold. No one paid much attention to Rose Gold. We thought she was a bit of a weird quirk of Liam's. He told us the story of how he'd found a golden statue in our valley and believed it was special enough to worship. To all of us, it just looked like a grotty-looking sculpture of a woman with a veil over her eyes. It stood in the middle of the marshy area around the river. Despite everything I'm going to tell you, I didn't ever get an evil vibe off Rose Gold. She made us all nervous, that's for sure. No one liked to be alone with her. It was a common dare to go stand by her in the middle of the night, and no one lasted long doing that, running back after 10 minutes at most. After I left this community, an investigator explained what Rose Gold was like to him. She was like when you went into one of those Christian or Catholic churches all by yourself and looked at the God's mum statue, Mother Mary or whatever. It was just eerie being around her, like she was somehow alive and watching. That's a good word. Rose Gold didn't feel evil or malicious, just very eerie. The community was based in a clearing down in the valley. There were jute and hemp fields that we made fabrics out of for our clothes, bedding, and tents. We grew fruit trees, kept a few goats for milk and cheese and chicken for eggs, had a veggie garden, and grew wheat to make basic breads. We didn't eat meat, and when I left I found out it was one of the biggest culture shocks learning most people ate animals. I still find the thought of eating a living creature absolutely bizarre. To me, it would be like eating a chunk of human flesh. But to each their own. I just wasn't raised that way. So we followed the wheel of the year, which meant we had a celebration nearly every season. This all happened around the spring equinox celebration called Ostera. We'd embroider rabbits onto our clothes and have egg-based meals, them having to do with fertility and all that. Really, it was an excuse to party and drink, just with nicer food to eat and better clothes to wear. So every year at Ostera, we had a little opening ritual that I found out later Liam had completely made up himself. We bustled around the podium in our best outfits, white tunics for the men and white dresses for the women, and all with the rabbit embroidery on the sleeves and hems. He was dressed in brown robes, with a horned headband in his blonde hair, emulating the god Pan. He was carrying a crochet blanket in his hands that was covering something. We all bustled forward, closer. Liam looked around us, letting the suspense build. Then he whipped the blanket away. Underneath was a little effigy of Rose Gold. At the base of the statue was a panel that said, "No" and "Go." "No Kothepo," said Liam as he held the effigy above his head. "Or go Kothepo." I always thought this opening ritual a waste of time. Why couldn't we go straight to the food and dancing? Still, I joined in on the chanting of, "No Kothepo, no Kothepo, no Kothepo." The odd opening ritual was the only time we ever did anything to do with Rose Gold. Every time the word "no" would glow more brightly, everyone would cheer and start the party. We were all struck into a dead silence as for the first time in my life, the word "go" glowed more brightly. Liam saw our faces and lowered the effigy, staring at it, mouth hanging open. All of us kids exchanged confused glances. The grown-ups looked absolutely horrified. "When's the party starting?" one of the little kids said, tugging on his mother's sleeve. "I'm hungry. Mama?" Finally, Liam cleared his throat, looking over at us. Rose Gold has spoken," he said, his voice hoarse. "Go Kothepo." As we set up the cushions and table for the food, there was a somber energy in the air that I'd never experienced at a seasonal celebration before. All of the kids were looking at each other with utter confusion as we sat cross-legged on the cushions. Liam took his place at the head of the table. "Let us commence the morning feast," he said. Then he reached for his first piece of bread. After he'd taken a sip of wine and a bite of bread, we all started to eat as well. There was no chatter or joking around like other years. The adults were either dead quiet or whispering worriedly behind their hands at each other. "He only invented the Kothepo to get rid of Carter," I heard one of the grown-ups whisper at the dinner table. "This is bullshit. I didn't sign up to be murdered. I thought this was supposed to be fun." One woman tutted and shook her head. "You did sign up for this. We all did. Nothing in life is easy. We barely do a thing for Rose Gold, and you can't even do this one thing for her." At the head of the table, Liam nodded. "The Kothepo isn't just mindless cruelty," he called across at us. "We are a community of pleasure, which means we're constantly growing. If we get too big, we won't be sustainable and collapse. This is a very unpleasant sacrifice, but that's what life is all about. Would you rather sacrifice your freedom to love and be one with nature, and to connect your souls with others? Or sacrifice just a few of us to keep our community strong and safe? All of us kids were growing more uneasy as we slowly realized what the Kothepo was. None of us had signed up for this. We'd been born into the community. We had to do whatever our parents did. Now, at the end of the morning feast, we shall pick an age group at random to participate in the Kothepo, said Liam. As the 30s through to 40s participated in the first Kothepo, they will have immunity from this one. Teenagers through to 20s and 50s through to 60s shall be in the running to participate this year. Whoever isn't chosen is guaranteed to participate in the third Kothepo, and then will reset again for the fourth. If you are 12 and under or 70 and over, you are exempt from the Kothepo. When he saw our drawn, frightened faces, he raised his wine glass. 3 men and 3 women will emerge victorious, he said. Their prize for surviving will be the opportunity to share in a love session with the great god Pan himself. He said it like it was a good thing we should be excited about. Everyone knew that whenever we were blessed with a meeting from Pan, it was really just Liam wearing a goat leg costume. Sharing a love session with Pan pretty much just meant having an orgy with Liam. You're probably thinking, wait, the prize is a romp with Pan, but teenagers were a part of the Kothepo? Was Liam going to sleep with underage kids? The answer was unfortunately yes. 13 and over, you were free game to the grown-ups. We didn't think anything of it. We were a bit grossed out, but accepting. I was never preyed upon, but others in my age range definitely were. It was just normal to us, though. If you'd have told us it's wrong and messed up that adults want to have sex with you, we'd have been gobsmacked. We'd been raised to think this was just how life was. I saw the whispering grown-ups ahead of me exchange looks, raising their eyebrows. One whispered, "It's gonna be the young ones, of course. Finally he gets another chance with Polly." I looked at Sky across the table, stirring his cup of iced tea. Who was Polly and Carter, you might be wondering? They were Sky's parents. Apparently, Liam was infatuated with Polly and had created the Kothepo just to get rid of Carter. Carter had just turned 30 and Polly and Liam were both 29 when the first Kothepo happened. The 30s through to 40s were drawn. After Carter had died, Liam quickly swooped on Polly, who fell pregnant with me and then died while giving birth. Sky had suffered some mysterious trauma when he turned 13. For a few years he refused to speak and would cry hysterically. Sky, who was a spitting image of his mother that Liam was obsessed with. No one said anything, but we all had a good idea about what might have happened to Sky. None of the adults had ever explained to us what the Kothepo even was until now. Maybe if they had, there'd have been more runaways. I think it was Leith who figured out that Liam had just squashed the term "control the population" into something short and snappy. Liam tried to have us believe rose gold chose our fate, but this wasn't the cursed rose gold statue. It was just an imitation. He'd created the little rose gold effigy, and it was solar powered. It lay in the sun all year. Then when he took it out and flicked a switch, either no or go would have absorbed the most energy and glow the strongest. After the feast was over, Liam picked up the effigy again. "Will the 50s through to 60s know or go the Kothepo?" he asked. We all stared as he put the effigy up above his head. We all watched as the word "no" glowed out. There was a harsh exhale from the entire community. "Rose Gold has spoken," he said. "The 50s through to 60s will not go the Kothepo. Therefore, the teens through to 20s will go the Kothepo." The grown-ups all reacted at once, some bursting into tears, others reaching to hug us young people who were just staring around, completely baffled. Just imagine every year of your childhood, your Easter celebration was a great time full of food and fun. You greatly looked forward to it. Then out of nowhere, One year your family tells you instead of a celebration, they're gonna send you to death instead. It was like a bizarre dream. All the little kids were getting increasingly upset and confused. The sadness of the adults seemed melodramatic and put on. The little kids, however, were genuine. I don't want him to die! A lot of them were crying to their mothers, burying their faces in their mothers' dresses. Why can't they stay? It's not fair. I hate rose gold. Their mothers hushed them nervously. Now we shall prepare for the funeral march, said Liam. This is time for everyone to say their goodbyes. Then at 3 a.m, the men shall take the raft to the river, and the women will go to Rose Gold for the dance. The survivors will shoot a flare to signal the end of the Kothepo and go to the clearing of love for their prize. The goodbyes were just mainly made up of mothers hugging their shell-shocked children who were standing around uselessly, not knowing what the hell to do. The next few hours were a blur, and 3 o'clock crept up fast and deadly. We were herded like sheep to the edge of the forest. Some of the adults grabbed their instruments, normally used for a big dance and sing-along. This time they began to play mournful music, like we did when people died. Others grabbed what we used as a table, raising it above their heads. They walked it over to the boys who took a hold of it. I realized if you flipped it over, it could be used as a raft. There were 10 girls and young women who were part of the dance. Myself, Daffodil, Belladonna, Juniper, Wisteria, Hazel, Winter, Briar, Wren, and Fern. The 8 boys and young men going down the river were Leaf, Sky, Morris, Robin, Rowan, Glenn, Blaze, and Forrest. Belladonna and Glenn were the oldest and expecting a baby. Wisteria and Blaze were the youngest, only 13 years old. Don't worry about remembering any of their names. As you might have gathered, you won't have to memorize most of them. I suggest you don't get attached to anyone either. Liam put his hands up to the sky, then he cried out, "Let the Kothepo begin." I was distracted from my reading by a commotion in the lounge room. I put down the book. Outside the window, I saw that the day was turning into evening, the sky darkening into navy. I went into the corridor and peered into the lounge room. There was movement beside me, and I turned to see Lou peering over my shoulder. "Who the fuck is out there?" Auntie Andy hissed, staring out of a crack in the curtains. On the armchair, my dad was curled up with his head buried in his arms, trembling. Lou and I tried to peer through one of the windows. Auntie Andy spotted us and glowered. "Get back to your rooms," she said, frantically waving her hand at us. We couldn't see anything in the wilds of the garden. My heart was in my throat. Was Rose Gold somewhere in the darkness waiting for us? I imagined the statue rising from the mud of the riverbank, floating down the walking path towards our house. Or would her legs move in unnatural spasms, creaking and squeaking as she made her way towards us? Then Lou beside me let out a sharp gasp, grabbing onto my arm. I looked over at where she was staring. In the window, I could see a figure. Not the veiled golden face, but an old man with long white hair and a yellow-toothed smile. When Auntie Andy saw him, all the color drained from her face. Then she bounded over, sweeping Lou and I up and shepherding us towards the armchair, which she stood over protectively, shielding us and her brother from view. "Screw off!" she screamed at the old man. "Get the hell out of here!" My dad burst into a fresh wave of tears. The old man kept staring at us with his sharp blue eyes. "That's no way to talk to her father, Dandelion," he said, and then cocked his head to the side. "Hello, Sky. Is that Eloise and Francis too? I've heard about them in your book, but I've never had the pleasure of meeting them." Auntie Andy grabbed her phone. "Get away from my family or I'm calling the cops, Liam." Liam from the book. What was he doing here? After 13 years, why had he come here now? The old man's smile fell away and he stared at us with an unsettling, hungry expression. "It's funny," he said. "I had a dream that Rose Gold led me to my daughter's door. This was meant to be, Dandelion. We weren't meant to be. We were meant to be reunited. You can't fight fate." Auntie Andy started tapping in the number to the cops. Liam moved quickly away from the window, running off and away into the night with startling speed. Why would Rose Gold bring him here? Auntie Andy said in a small voice after she'd gotten off the phone with the police. My dad slowly peered up from his arms, staring at Lou and me with his big brown eyes. You made wishes, he said to us. After a few moments, Lou and I nodded. Auntie Andy let out a long, rattling breath. Monkey's paw, said Dad. Auntie Andy wouldn't let us back in our rooms. She gathered up blankets and pillows and kept us all in the lounge room. Is Liam gonna hurt us? I said with my blanket up to my eyes. The two winced in surprise, obviously forgetting for a moment that I'd read about him in the book. No, I have told the police and they're on their way now, said Auntie Andy. I'm gonna call for your uncle to come here as well. I feel like she was trying to downplay the situation to keep us calm. Can we have the books? Asked Lou. I want to read the rest. Auntie Andy shifted uncomfortably on the spot before getting to her feet. She nearly ran for the corridor. I felt like the dark window was watching us. I wish we could draw the blinds, but I didn't want to get up and go over. I buried my face away in my blankets. Here you go, said Auntie Andy, reappearing with the books. Dad got up from the couch. Cup of tea? He said in his quiet voice. Hot chocolate? He limped around the kitchen, getting us all hot drinks. I opened up the book and continued reading. Dandelion, of course, can't tell you what happened on the river, so I'll let you know. We walked, single file out of the clearing. The rest of the community were playing mournful music, thumping drums like a funeral dirge. As we approached the river, we broke into two groups, the boys putting the raft down at the riverbed, the girls continuing into the forest. There were teary faces and sniffling everywhere. All of us boys climbed into the raft, and Glenn pushed us into the water before climbing in after us. We began to drift gently away. Our little lethal river trip had begun. Including me, there were 8 guys on the raft. Morris, formerly Luna, had come out as trans when we were kids. I used to think that although the cult was terrible, the one good thing about it was that it wasn't bigoted. Morris only got flack for not changing his name to something more nature-themed. Dandelion pointed out to me later that Liam's little love party only had white people in it, so all the adults were most likely racist. I hadn't even realized that. Then there was Sky. Something happened to him a few years before. He'd always been a bit slower than the rest of us, but suddenly he stopped talking and was prone to crying fits. It took a few years, but finally he'd begun to talk again, although it was limited. He clung to Morris like a security blanket who was very protective of him. Glenn was the oldest of us and expecting a child with one of the girls, Belladonna. Blaze, who was the youngest of us at 13, had a bad squint and in hindsight probably should have been wearing glasses, but our backwards little cult didn't accept that. Then there was Forrest, who was a big gangling joker. Finally, there were the 2 twins, Robin and Rowan. The funeral music had changed to something strange and ominous. We all shifted uncomfortably on the raft. We're pretty lucky, said Rowan. There's not as much of us compared to the girls. It'll be hard to lose so many of them. Yeah, but all they have to do is dance, said Blaze. It's bullshit that we have to row down the river and they just have a party. Blaze was the most bitter of us, and I didn't blame him. He'd only just turned 13. If the Kothepo had been done literally a week earlier, he would have been safe. It seemed particularly unfair that he had to participate. Seriously? Said Morris, glaring at him. They're dancing to the death. They're not allowed to stop for a second. At least we get to have a lie down. Most of us are going to have a pretty chill death compared to them. What would you prefer, just quickly drowning or dying of hypothermia? Argued Blaze. 'Cause we're getting the long, slow death. I don't know if it's just me, but I prefer neither of those, said Forrest to bitter smiles from the rest of us. Flowers, said Sky, leaning down to scoop up petals from the river surface. He sniffed them and then smiled. Roses. Blaze just sneered. Yeah, roses. Sky, aren't they pretty? Said Morris, the harsh look on his face softening. "Speaking of roses," said Forrest as we looked over at him. "You know, compared to Pan, Rose Gold's pretty crap at throwing a party," said Forrest, and this got laughs even from Blaze. "Tell me about it," muttered Rowan. "She's a bloody maul, isn't she?" "Yeah, what a slag," Forrest said in an exaggerated old voice. "What a slag." He started clapping his hands together. "Rose Gold, you're mold. Na 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 na. Rose Gold, you're old. Na 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 na," he chanted. "Come on, guys, join in." Laughing, I started to clap and chant as well, along with the twins. Sky was giggling, and Morris and Blaze were smirking and shaking their heads. "Rose Gold, you're mold. Na 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 na. Rose Gold, you're old. Na 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 na." "You're like 24 years old, Forrest," said Blaze, although he was amused. "How is it that I'm more mature than you?" "Maturity is for suckers. I'm gonna be immature until I die," Forrest replied. "Which will probably be in a few hours, let's be real." Blaze snorted. "I'm wondering if dying will be better," said Rowan. "I don't want to have an orgy with any of you guys, and especially not Liam." Sky stopped laughing at once. He stared down at the river, fiddling around with one of the flower petals. "If you could pick any of the girls to survive, who would it be?" asked Forrest. All of us teenagers cringed at once. "Well, only the older ones, obviously," said Rowan. "Anyone under 20 might be a sister, you know. So like Winter, Briar, Daffodil, and Belladonna. No offense, Glenn." Glenn just shrugged. "Sex apparently helps a baby get born, so I don't mind," he said. "It comes out with a big dent in its head, though," said Forrest at once, to peals of laughter from all of us. "Flatter yourself much?" said Rowan, elbowing Forrest. The night drew on as we swatted mosquitoes and chatted aimlessly. This whole river cruise to the death wasn't too bad. I reckoned we had lucked out compared to the girls. Most of us were probably going to just quietly freeze to death, and at least we were doing it in nice, calm company. "You've barely said a word, Robin," I said after a while. "You okay?" Robin swallowed roughly. "Just feeling a bit seasick," he said. "And you know, bloody scared of dying, of course." "Aren't we all?" Morris muttered sympathetically. He reached down the front of his shirt and then pulled a rope and bag out. We all looked at him. "Managed to sneak some food in," he said, and all of us but Blaze crowed delightedly as he opened up the bag. Inside were hunks of bread and cheese. "That's so stupid," Blaze snapped at Morris. "The whole point of keeping food from us is to kill us off. The faster people die, the faster this is over." "You don't have to have it," Morris countered as the rest of us eagerly grabbed handfuls. Forrest wiggled a chunk of cheese in front of Blaze's glaring face. "Come on, you know you want it," he said in a sing-song voice. "Yum, yum, yum." Blaze slapped his hand away. Still, after a few moments, he reached for the food as well. "This will be a last meal for a lot of us," said Glenn as we ate. "I've always wanted to be a dad. I was so excited when Belladonna got pregnant. What if we both get wiped out?" "I think both of you getting wiped out is the second best option," said Morris. "It'll be so much worse if one of you survives and the other doesn't." Glenn nodded. "That's true," he said. "If one of us has to die, I hope it's me. If she dies, she's taking the baby with her." "I hope you both make it," I said, and everyone else nodded. "To Belladonna and Glenn making it," said Forrest, raising his piece of bread. Then he laughed as though figuring out a joke. "A toast! A toast!" he said, motioning at the bread, and we all groaned at the bad pun. Still, we all knocked our bits of bread together. "To Belladonna and Glenn making it," we said. "And to us soon-to-be deceased suckers, an easy death," said Forrest. "Hear, hear," we all said back. We fell silent. Sky yawned. "Might as well get some sleep," said Glenn. I'd say see you in the morning, but who knows if I'll make it through the night, said Forrest as he lay down on the raft. Sweet dreams, everyone. We all muttered good nights as we laid down to sleep. It was hard to doze off. I felt my icy cold skin crawling with mosquitoes. It was freezing and I tried to tug at my tunic to cover more of my exposed skin, tried to breathe on my hands for warmth. I'd never been that cold in my life and would never be that cold again. It felt like ice water had replaced my blood, shards of cold stabbing into my bones. Every exposed bit of skin was numb. I did drift off, but I don't know if it was into a proper sleep or into a hypothermia-induced unconsciousness. All I know is that I must have fallen asleep because I was woken again later in the night. There was screaming far away in the forest. It sounded like the girls, all wailing and sobbing together. I looked around the group. Everyone was still alive, although Robin looked very ill, sallow with vomit trickling down the side of his mouth. The screaming got louder and more intense. None of us said a word, just silently floating down the black water. People over by the statue had obviously begun to drown. The music was feverish, maniacal, all crashing drums and low droning that made my icy skin prickle. It mixed up with the wails of the girls like they were some kind of horrible chorus singing along. Then there were crashing footsteps through the forest. We all shrunk up together. I became aware of a presence at the riverbank, but I couldn't see what was in the darkness. "Come on!" A voice that sounded like Hazel said. "Come on, get off the raft!" "Come on!" the voice of Fern called. "This is bullshit, we don't have to do this." "It's a hallucination," said Blaze at once. "Guys, we're all getting hypothermia. We're gonna start seeing and hearing things, alright? Don't go plunging into the goddamn river." "How are we all having the same vision?" Rowan countered. "Maybe it's a trick," said Forrest nervously. "Maybe it's rose gold and she's trying to get us to run into the water?" There was a scream of frustration. "You're gonna die on that river," yelled what sounded like Gwen. "Don't you understand?" Robin staggered forward, his eyes clouded over with sickness. He crashed into the water and began to doggy paddle forward. "No!" screamed Rowan. "You're already sick, you can't take the cold." We watched helplessly as Rowan jumped in after him. "Come on, come on!" the voices of the girls yelled out. The twin brothers swam through the black water towards their voices. Soon they had reached the riverbank. "Careful of the—" Morris tried to yell, but Robin had already clambered onto the mossy rocks. He slipped at once and cracked his head on the rock. Rowan let out a hoarse, choked scream. We all beckoned and yelled after him, but he didn't seem to hear us. He looked absolutely lost as he cradled his brother, just staring after us with faraway eyes. He remained in the icy cold water, watching us disappear down the river. The raft kept floating on, and soon we lost sight of him. The voices of the three girls had fallen quiet. I wondered if they'd ever been there at all. I still don't know what was out there that night, if it was actually the girls or something else. No one said a word. Sky was breathing heavily, voice harsh and short. Morris was mindlessly stroking Sky's hair in an automatic soothing motion. Forrest's eyes were full, barely subdued terror, endlessly licking his lips. Glenn had his knees to his chest, burying his face away. I didn't know how long we traveled for, time melting together into a mindless blur. I could see that the dawn was breaking. The black night sky was shot through with pink streaks, the golden sun rising over the horizon. "I bet you all want me to die," Blaze said suddenly. "You're all against me, I can tell." "No one's against you," I said at once. "We don't want anyone to die." "Bullshit," said Blaze. "Forrest is funny, Glenn has a baby on the way, you're the nice guy, and Morris and Sky are boyfriends or whatever. Then there's me, just some kid no one likes. You all secretly want me to go next." He got to his feet and the raft teetered to and fro. We all clutched to the sides, trying not to be flung into the water. "Sit down, you idiot," Morris snarled. "That's it. You just think I'm a dumb kid, don't you?" Blaze screamed, stamping his foot. Water surged onto the raft as we tried to keep steady. Yeah, I do. You're trying to capsize the boat because of a temper tantrum. Morris sneered back. I didn't know they let toddlers do the Kothepo. Blaze launched at him in a fury of flying fists. Morris grappled with him, trying to block the attacks and push him away. Hit back! Hit back! You talk shit and you can't even take a punch, Blaze was shouting. Calm down, yelled Glenn. What's the matter with you? Sky had his arms over his head, rocking on the spot, his eyes clenched shut. I exchanged looks with Forrest. The raft was approaching a low-hanging branch. Blaze was going to be knocked down. Duck! I said, but Blaze was too in a rage to notice. Duck! With a thump, Blaze was smacked in the back of the head and fell into the water. Morris immediately scrabbled to his knees, sticking out his hand. Grab my hand, come on, we'll get you back on, he shouted as Blaze splashed desperately in the water. He grabbed Morris's hand, tugging hard. I still don't know if he did it on purpose or if it was an accident. I like to think it was an accident that Blaze didn't try to take Morris down with him. No! Screamed Sky as Morris hit his chin on the edge of the raft, crashing into the river as well. The two of them disappeared under the surface. No, please! Sky sobbed as the raft floated away. We couldn't see them in the dark water. The current was growing faster, more dangerous. Almost as if nature was trying to fasten this all up for us. Soon the patch of water where they'd fallen had disappeared over the horizon. I put my arms around Sky, who was breathing harshly, face a terrified mask. It's okay, I said as his breath got shorter until he was heaving for oxygen. I thought he was going to pass out. The sky was pink and yellow as the early morning drew on. Birds were waking up, chirping away like it was any other normal day. The light illuminated the bushes and trees along the river, and in my fear they looked jagged and threatening, the birds song like cawing vultures. The last of us, Glenn whispered, hugging his knees to his chest, burying his face away. The last of us. Just let this be over. There was a burst of laughter, and I looked up and saw Forrest with a wide grin, pointing somewhere in the distance. Looking over, I saw nothing but the pink sunrise. Forrest kept on laughing and laughing. Rose gold, you're old, you're mold, as old as the sun. No, much older, with white gnashing teeth. Forrest screamed, eyes bugging, froth at his cracked lips. She'll never be satisfied. She's always hungry. Moloch, and darkness and decay, and the rose death held imitable sway over them all. Let us be, Queen Bee, leave us be, Queen Bee. The last word was stretched out into a maniacal wail as he clutched at his neck. His nails dug into the flesh as he began to claw and rip, choking on the blood as he tore out his own throat. Red liquid gushed down his white tunic as he fell to his knees. He fell into the water, still trying to scream through his mangled vocal cords. I clutched at Sky, who was sobbing into my shoulder. Glenn and I watched the body float away, face contorted into a grotesque, grinning mask. No one said a word. The current had calmed again, and the raft gently floated over to a bend in the river, hitting the bank and coming to a stop. I wonder if we would have reached the river bend if Forrest was still with us. If we had all died earlier, would the river bend have appeared out of nowhere? Was nature waiting for us to get down to 3 before ending the trip for us? Silently, we climbed out of the raft. We were all trembling in the cold and shock, standing close together for warmth. The Kothepo was over. We had survived.